Hello, everybody. This is the Achilles Justice with the Philosophy Society. It is October 4th, 2023. We're at the Toronto Metropolitan University Library. Today it's a different room, but the same idea. So, hi. We have people in the room today. Very nice to see you guys. And people on the way. And we have some people attending virtually as well. Recording this for the YouTube channel later on for all those who cannot presently make it. Just give me a second and check one more administrative thing. Cool. Okay, so today we are going to continue with some ideas from last time. So basically, I was talking in an inadvertent way or an unmathematical way. I was talking about functions last time. And I don't want to say it was an exhaustive list, but that is what I was going through, right? Like behavior, attitudes. These are all things the mind can do with some end, right? So we have the being, and then this would be the function, which is a means. And then there's some end in mind or goal. Now, values can in some ways be the reason why I do something, but I can also be trying to attain some value. So the value can kind of be on either side. Now, I wanted to kind of focus today on the ends or the goals. And is there certain, like, what would these be, right? How are they not just different for, like, are they different for everybody? That's the first thing. And what would it look like if there was some kind of universality to this? So there would be a universal application to people in general. And so what are we really working with? So if it was universal, it would have to be based on something that is constant. One constant would be something like the human condition. Another one would be like maybe cosmological constants. For example, like time and space. And then we can go on from there. So some goals we have in mind, or maybe principles. Principles are going to be like an action-oriented end directed towards the mean. It's like how to achieve the end. So it's like do X, and then therefore you will get Y. Yeah. Right? So principles in some ways are distilled or simplistic ways to kind of solve the complexity of what we perceive. Right? And so there's different kinds of principles based on certain values. So if we have a value for like well-being. And so the human condition, this is also an axiom. So our axioms are in some ways like assumptions. We could maybe talk about something about a priori, but that's a different thing. Things that we know without even having experience. But at least axioms, we can understand this from a logical context that they are foundational for the system to work. And when I say it's an assumption, I'm like, some people might disagree that we're human. You know what I mean? and that's good. I don't know how far you're going to get down that path, but I'm at least leaving it open to discussion. Okay, for those that do disagree on whatever that may be, right? They might say like the human condition is variable. It's not a constant. You know what I mean? Or consciousness. So that like one other property could be consciousness. And we talked about that before as like a common denominator in our experience, that it's used in the functionality, right? So within here, consciousness is always part of that, We could talk about how I might not be aware of sometimes when I'm doing certain habits, I just do them. But in advance, I can premeditate or visualize a set of habits, and then they'd be executed while I'm not aware of them in the future. Or you could say like, well, this person was drunk and they were not of sound mind. They lacked consciousness. They were not, they were impaired or whatever. So anyways, let's just not look at those for now. And so another principle we could talk about like maybe goodness, and we can like discuss ethics, right? And so there's certain ethical principles that through our functionality, we can get there, right? There's kind of an equivocation on function there. Psychologically, when we talk about a mental illness, we're talking about dysfunction. And in this way, I'm using function in like a mathematical sense, right? Maybe they are the same, but in some ways, I think we could have ways of reasoning that leads to an equivocation, which would be a fallacy. So let's just be aware of that and identify it if it pops up, you know? Yeah. And so I don't know if I've gone through the ethical principles before, so we'll just list them here. So one is beneficence, which is like to do good. Two is non-maleficence. So it's to not harm. Three is autonomy, which is like your agency or your capacity to make like informed decisions. Four, we could say, is justice, which in some ways is like fairness. Five is utilitarianism. So it's the greatest good for the greatest number. Going over here. Six is the categorical imperative, which is don't use people as a means to an end. And seven is universalizability, which is we want to be able to universalize actions. Sounds like that. Right. So when we're doing certain things, and these are based in somewhat of a social contract context, you know, like in the cosmos, you could say, is there ethics with the lion eating the gazelle, right? The lion is clearly causing harm to the gazelle. But if the lion doesn't eat, it's causing harm to itself. So is that an ethical paradox, right? Other ethical paradoxes, obviously, we have like the trolley case, boom. So if you're on a train with a track and there's a split second for you to shift the direction of the train, on the left side, there's one person. On the right side, there's two people, right? Which way do you go? And if you're a utilitarian and the people are, there's no difference between the people. You can't even see who they are. You would go with the one person, right? There's less harm being done because the quantity is less. And then if you start stipulating and like say like the one person's a criminal, or sorry, the two people are criminals in the act, and then the one person is innocent, then maybe it would be better to go the other way, right? So, or if you know the person, if it's like your kid, like there's a bunch of different properties we can attribute to it. Yeah.
Just when you use the example of lion, something came to mind that may be of interest. I remember the Lion King, where the son at some point asked the father about the fact that they eat other animals, and is it good, is it bad, like even if bad. And what the father answers is that, well, we do it in a sustainable manner.
Okay.
So like we don't eat more than we need, and it's like he uses the example of circle of life. I think that someday we will die and we'll go to the ground, and like the zebras would be able to eat the plants that come from us, the circle of life. And then the idea that hyenas, if the hyenas come in power, they would deplete the jungle. So our job is to manage the jungle in a sustainable way.
Yeah, like balance. That's like a justice argument in some ways, right? Which we can talk about that. Like, it's whether the gazelle willingly gives themselves up for this purpose is a different thing. You know, most animals scream in pain when they're physically suffering. You know, so I'm not really interested in getting into that topic right now, but that's a very fruitful area of discussion. The main difference is that as human beings, or a certain category of human beings that have a certain degree of their cognitive capacity. If you can think in terms of language, right, or in propositions, and you understand your actions and the implications of your actions, or at least retroactively, right? If in the moment your consciousness is depleted, but you can reflect, and then you can change your course of action that way. So that's a good thing to make a note of. So there's like present awareness, and you can make decisions there, right? That's good. But also number 2, reflective awareness, and maybe projective, which is the future. And we really want to utilize all 3 of them to the best of our ability. Yeah, last time we talked about certain goals. So part of the thing, going back to like the well-being and mental health stuff, is like just your state in your life, you know? And so what's going on with your life? Like what's happening? And if there are some things that either in the moment don't feel good, that's not a universal criteria for it being bad. For example, I was at the dentist like last week or something like that. And before I was on the chair, I had like a little bit of anxiety. When I was in the chair and I saw the drill, I was like, you know, when the drill was doing its work, it was a little uncomfortable. So in those moments, I didn't feel good. And so I can't just have a universal application that all negative sensations or emotions are always bad, right? There may be some short-term loss for a long-term gain. And so this is kind of like a principle, right? So we almost have like a list of principles. And that principle is like a belief that the user or the conscious being has, right? So we can use P1 to guide ourselves through the means to end up at the end goal. And so the end goal is like oral hygiene, for example, you know? And part of it is that I know that the amount of suffering in the long run is going to be way higher than the present 5-minute, hello, brother. Nice to see you. I am discussing. So we're a conscious being, right? I'm just going to do a quick review.
Yeah.
And we have sometimes goals in mind or an end, right? And there's some function that we can, so we talked about last time was the function part. So we have like habits and behavior, we have beliefs, we have our attitudes, we have our social group, there's the situation itself that we're in, our environment. And all of these factors in some ways function for us to get to some goal. Now, some goals may be intended, others are unintended, right? So you might end up in a position and you're like, I didn't even mean to be here. Or like someone buys you a lottery ticket and you win the lottery. It's like, what? You can not accept the ticket, yes. But if it was your property and you didn't even ask for it and you won, that's a great situation that you never intended to be in, right? So the question today was, are there universal principles or properties that apply to all beings? That's the first thing. Is that a thing, right? And then the second thing would be like, what is a principle? And what kind of principles are there, and how do they mesh in with this situation here, right? So some of the universal conditions would be constants to the being. And so one of those constants, or the thing that is perceiving right now, whatever we want to call it, right? One of them would be the human condition. And one of the factors within that is just consciousness. And all of the functional elements of the being, consciousness is always part of it. And the more depreciated consciousness is, the less of a being you are in some ways. Like you are existing. Existence and a being are kind of like, existence is first. And then number 2 is like being. It's almost like an awareness of your existence, right? Like there is the cat being, sure, like a human being, the cat being, but the cat really isn't aware of its catness. It just kind of is. It just is a cat. You know? So another universal thing is like a cosmological condition. The humans are within the cosmos, a larger context, and there's time and space as properties of the cosmos. There are other things like the 4 fundamental forces of the universe. So we can talk about forces, right? That's something that we kind of have to deal with. Like your disagreement with gravity will only go so far, you know? And you can test that, but at the end of the day, it might kill you. When we look at the functional part, values can be the introduction of you engaging in some process, some means to end. And values can also be the end goal themselves. You want to uphold some value or get to something that you have a value. Other ends or goals could be like ethical principles. And so I listed 7, like I would say they're like the main 7 ethical principles. Beneficence, which is to do good. Non-maleficence, which is to not cause harm. Autonomy, which is like your agency in making decisions, informed decisions. Justice, which is fairness. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. The categorical imperative, not to use others as a means to an end. And universalizability, which is fundamentally every action ought to be universalized to all people, not just specific to one person. So I can't like have an exception to the rule. Oh, I'm stealing just now just because it's like there's a reason why, you know? If everybody stole in society would break down and it wouldn't work. So principles in themselves are action oriented toward the end. They're supposed to have, it's supposed to be some particular kind of information or belief, some statement that I could say to myself to help me get through bad habits, for example, right? Or to distill out the chaos of my experience into a simplified format. That way I'm more likely to get to my end. So in the format of something like, if you do X, then you will achieve Y, right? And not all principles might be in that form because there's a principle like, I'm going to engage in a short-term loss for a long-term gain. So I might have to reword it, but the meaning of the principle is kind of embedded in there, right? And there's a lot of wisdom in principles. That's something that's important. You'll get these like one-liners, like Confucius said, or the master said, you know, and there'll be like some statement and you're supposed to follow that, right? So, okay, yeah. And there's certain axioms that this system is founded upon. The human condition is one of them. Or a priori knowledge that we can have, for example, that time and space are like universal. And then within our decision-making capacities, I can have, like, how do I gain control over this condition or the situation, right? I can be aware of things in the present moment, and I can change and navigate myself there. But sometimes maybe I'm not mindful of the moment, and I look back, and I'm like, oh, what did I do? You know, that was something that was not necessarily good for me, right? So I'm being reflective. Or I can project to what might happen in the future. There's a possibility that this might be the case. Or if I do X, then Y will occur, right? If I drink a lot of alcohol, I will get drunk. I have to drive home tonight, therefore it's not a good idea to drink a lot of alcohol. And so those are 3 ways that we can apply this to how we're acting or being in the world to achieve whatever ends or goals we have. And so some of these other goals might be the value of well-being, which is the absence of mental illness, right? So any kind of, or eudaimonia is another way, another good, which is like the good life, right? And so the good life means that like whatever's going on right now is worth it because there's something that, there's a greater picture here. There's a trajectory that I'm going on or to. And then we have the ethical, like being good, or how the evaluation of an action is, right? And that's where we input those ethical principles. And so, okay, so one big thing here, so now we're caught up. Good? Okay, so now we're at situations. I think situations are important because one thing is they're very social, right? You might have a situation where you're just the only one in it, you know? So there's social stuff, there's cell stuff, you know? And that's something for us to figure out, you know? And so if you look at like your trajectory over time, so like this is like your well-being, it's a time, and let's say you're right here, you know? It's like a 3. And you would prefer to be like up to like 9. No, that's better for me. That's the life I want to live, whatever it is, right? And so what would it take for me to make this kind of a jump here? It's most likely going to be incremental to some degree. The nature of this curve, we could discuss that. And the in some ways we use the word sustainability, something like that, or resilience. So if somebody, like when we look at people that win the lottery, using that example again, after 6 months, they usually go back down to baseline. So they'll have a spike and then they'll go back down, and like reports of well-being and stuff like that. Right. So for example, and even though they have a lot of money, if their interpersonal issues with like their close loved ones or whatever, their partner is causing them a lot of stress and strain, then the money is not really going to change that. Unless you use the money to like hire a therapist or something. Well, all right, that's making a difference now, Or if the problem was with like not being able to afford food. And just for whatever reason, you just were in a position in your life with your family, maybe you have kids, something like that, you couldn't figure that out. You just couldn't manage it. It just didn't happen. And then you win the lottery and now, but you know how to manage money. Or you have that sense. And so you manage it, you're okay. Okay, that's good. The evidence, though, is that they usually go back down to baseline. So what we're looking for here is a sense of resilience in our well-being. So that with this projective awareness, like if there's a gap, if there's like a disability, or I'm proactive and I prevent certain kinds of things, that's better for me, right? And better for everyone in some ways. So what would those things be? So we have like resilience is one thing, maybe durability, sustainability. So what properties, so this is going to be a goal / value, right? And the reason we have those is because they will preserve whatever degree of well-being we have. That way our well-being is not just going like this. We want it to kind of go up and maybe plateau at the very least, right? And if there's a little bit of a blur, that's fine. It just goes back up again. Hello. Welcome to the group.
Hello, group.
Jeremy, Dimitri, Jeremy.
Nice to meet you. How are you? James?
Have we done that before? I think.
Sorry?
We met before.
Yes, once more, I believe.
It's coffee time.
How are you?
Oh, good.
Bringing love all over the place, my friend. Very good.
Not enough women in this world.
You want to say something?
Sure. Just a point I wanted to make when you had mentioned about people who win the lottery. It has also been said that money amplifies the acquisition of money amplifies both your positive and negative traits.
Yep.
So in a way, it would be optimal if you rectified any issues you had before acquiring the money, because it's just going to get worse. And when you mentioned that the best way to do it would be kind of go up and then possibly plateau, Einstein himself said that we cannot solve problems with the same level of consciousness that we had created those problems. So I'm just trying to draw a parallel with what you said, that rectifying something would require a much higher level of I don't know, intelligence.
Yeah, it's like if you have a predisposition toward addictions or substance use, or if there's a bit of a cocaine problem, right? You can't say no to it, and then you walk into 50, you get an inheritance. You got 50 grand in your bank account now, right? Like what's the statistical probability of that person spending $40,000 on cocaine? You know what I mean? I don't know. I know of people that's happened, and it's a little sad, right? Because then they look back, they're like, oh, they use their reflective awareness. They're like, oh, like if I didn't spend all that money on the cocaine, I could have, for example, went to school, or I could have done this now, But in some ways, and that's a lack of wisdom. I would in some ways say that is the contrary to what it would mean to be wise. Some mistakes are better to not be made at all. And the wise thing to do would be to just not make that mistake in the first place. So don't be empirical. Yep.
When you say lack of wisdom, is that similar to or different to lack of reasoning?
Reasoning could have been the thing to lead to the wisest outcome if you were a contributing factor in the outcome. Natalia brought up today, as I was getting frustrated with people on the road, that Achilles, if it's not in your control, don't be upset about it. And I've probably told her that same phrase like 20 times. She's like, my psychologist said this. And I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. So, and she's right. And that's why I told it to her. So she can remind me when I'm being foolish. And yeah, so, okay. Yes, very good. Very good. So, okay, with these goals, no, these are not content goals. So a content goal, so you think like, there's this thing here, squiggly. So there's something inside the thing. Like I want a TV, for example. I actually don't want one, but that's something you could say. Or I want a standard car. I want like a fucking Camaro. That's a content goal. It's not really that important, but I would prefer that to my current SUV Equinox. This is what I would prefer, because it's standard, you know, any kind of sports car would be better. Just because I could drive in the expressway, it'd be more efficient. Maybe not as safe, but more efficient. Okay, so there's a content goal. Or like, let's say I want my psychology and my next psychology degree, right? That's a content goal. It's a specific thing. It doesn't even have to specifically be material, but it's a concrete subject-oriented goal. It could even be a character thing, right? Like I want to round out my shoulders next for working out, you know? So I'm going to do side lifts, front lifts. I'm going to do deltoids, a bunch of different things, right? So there's content goals. But then there's like process goals, right? And process goals are that which I use to achieve the content goal. So the process goal, it's not like the means to the content. So like there's a means here, right? The thing that gets me there. So if it's the car, the means to get there would be money. Right? If it's muscle or like an exercise goal, where's my marker? So it's like your physical stuff, right? There's going to be like habits and training. Training, habit, maybe diet, right? These are the things. So there's the goal and then there's the means. Right? What was the other one we had? Like character. I want to be like a nicer person. Right? So the habit will also apply to this. Could be awareness. Okay?
The habit would apply to what?
Being nicer. Having a habit of being kind.
So the habit is the mean to, I guess, the other type of goal.
Yeah, so let's
not
pick
the material one.
we'll pick different goals. So this one's a physical thing. It's like, you know, this one like it's an object. This one's my body. Or if I have like a heart condition, I want to make sure I take my medication on time, right? If this one's a character thing, I want to not get frustrated with the dogs when they bark. So I mentioned this like maybe 6 weeks ago as something I need to improve on. And since then, every time the little dog barks, I do this.
That's an Atomic Habits.
Because if I match the excitement to the dog with my mirror neurons, I just go, and I bark just like the dog, I'm just as bad as the dog. Right? Whereas if I go, I'm doing an asymmetrical habit that calms me down, and then from the place of being calm, I can say, dog, stop barking. And like a stern, assertive voice. Yes.
Would you say that character is a psyche?
Yeah, but it also includes like the way you act too. It's not just the way you think. So one could be like less distorted thinking.
The psyche, or
Yeah. The psyche is like the soul, and psychology is like the study of the psyche, you know, or the study of the soul. But we don't really use the word soul anymore. We use the word mind now. It's like an updated version of it. It's like soul version 3.0. You know.
So do you believe that the soul is limited to the mind?
Yeah, it's just like in a religious way, you can talk about soul. It's just that we get into like weird philosophical like problems, like where is it? You can say the same thing about mind, like where's the mind? But the difference between like, so we say like soul and mind, right? And we want to like, it has to do something with this thing, right? So the soul is almost like an aura, or like in the being. It's like your essence, you know? And it's connected, like if you're Christian, to like the Holy Spirit, you know, like there's some connection between like the soul and the Holy Spirit. And then you could say that there's also a connection between like the soul and Big G, but also a connection to like the devil. That's where your soul's gonna go, you know? And it's like it's a thing, you know what I mean? So there's that whole explanation of soul, that's a lot to talk about, right?
So consciousness is the soul, or it's part of the soul.
Well, so there's different ways to explain it. This is how I communicate it, so it makes sense,
Mhm.
right? So this story, this like Christian story of accounting for the soul, is one way to talk about this stuff. Another way we could talk about it is the mind, right? Or the Geist. And the mind has a lot to do with the brain, right? Because if the brain gets affected, like if you say that person has a great soul, right? And then they get hit in the front of the head. Now, if there's brain damage, it will dramatically affect that person. And so it's like, well, how does it make sense? Because the soul is not supposed to be material, and neither is the mind. It's not a thing, right? So how is it the case that if someone gets hit in the head by like a hammer, right? And then now they're like swearing and they're aggressive, whereas they used to be a very calm, cool person before. But after the brain injury, they're a completely different person. The soul thesis doesn't make sense, but the mind thesis does, because the mind, what we would call, is a supervenient property on the brain, and it has different elements to it. And if this part of the brain gets affected, it will have an effect on the mind.
That's true, because there was one scientist, actually, he was a therapist, I believe, and he was like, had these bunch of stories of children with psychological problems, like very rowdy kids that would draw very distorted drawings. And everyone always used to look at the subject through asking questions through just psychology. So he started doing brain scans, and he noticed there was like matter missing, quote unquote, like inactive parts of the brain, which was causing them to act in that certain way. So what he did was, there's one kid, his nephew actually, he was the one that was drawing all those very distorted and dark drawings, and they ended up finding that he had a tumor in his head.
Mm-hmm.
They removed the tumor, and his behavior changed immediately, and he went to being the sweetest boy from being a little devil child, basically.
Right? And 200-300 years ago, kids that were perceived as devil children, bad things happened to them, right? And they may have thought that following instructions in the Bible, right? Or like, if she sinks, she wasn't a witch and she's going to go to heaven. If she floats, she's a witch, so burn her. That kind of attitude, not cool, right? Yes.
I'd also like to add that 1 in 100,000 babies that are born have the brain wiring that is considered part of psychopathy. There are parts of their brain that do not light up, that normally light up in a healthy brain. And those things that light up tend to be what help you make good decisions in certain situations. Whereas in those babies, when they grow older, they will make decisions that you and I might think are immoral or unethical, but to them it feels perfectly natural to do certain things like murder or stealing, etc. Just to.
So you have one thing?
Oh, I'm good.
Okay. So this is a great thing to talk about right now, because so now we kind of talk about the mind soul thing. So we're like, okay, we figured that, right? Very quickly. So now we have this problem of like, what happens if there is a problem with the brain? And first of all, if that person is like, but I want to murder people, like, this isn't, what are you talking about? I love it. It's great. You know what you're talking about? Like, I'm a person, you're a person. You do your thing, I'll do my thing. Don't worry about me. I'm gonna go and murder these people. This is what I want to do. Right? You eat plants. You know, no one complaining about that. You eat animals. Why can't I go murder humans? Come on. What do you say to that guy or girl? Right? Person. So it's on the board, right? I'm trying to make it like funny because it's like obviously pretty serious, but so that's where we have our ethical principles. Or what kind of a world do you want to live in? Right? And it's not fair. So when it comes to animals eating animals, we could say there's a difference in the food chain, right? And we evolved as omnivores. The way in which the industry of like butchering animals and how they're raised, we could criticize that. So it's as humane as possible. But we do have, like, I have canine teeth for a reason, because it was used in my genetic history of ripping the flesh off of animals and eating them, right? Which is a different thing than how they're raised and how they're euthanized, we could say. Being euthanized and slaughtered may be two different things, right? Euthanized for another species to eat them is one thing, and then slaughtered in a slaughterhouse where it's unsanitary and, you know, they know they're going to be killed is a different thing, right? So humans they're sentient beings. They can, you know, more so than to a very high degree compared to all the other animals on the planet. And they're autonomous, you know. There's some humans that have disabilities that may not have that same level, but they're still human. And so they still have the same rights. And so that kind of a person would be violating ethical principles. It's not universalizable. It's violating the categorical imperative, right? The psychopath would say, well, would you like to be eaten alive? Why don't you just give yourself up? Do a tit for tat, you know? It's not like you're like, you eat my leg, I'll eat your leg, and we'll just go until we both die. That's not, you're just eating everybody. Okay? Because you could just put two psychopaths in the room and let them eat each other. Has that already solved the problem? I don't know. Probably not, because it's still violating the categorical imperative. And so, yeah, and so what we're doing now is we're saying, well, what do we use to evaluate the goal and the value itself? How do we make sense of this? So it's different than the second order. So there's two different parts here. There's the content of the goal, right? There's the goal, content goals, and then process goals, which is like resilience, durability, sustainability, right? And so process goals, that in a large part is going to lead to well-being. So that's where like exercising, reducing the amount of alcohol intake you have, you know, not smoking, finding healthy ways like slow breathing. Those are process goals. And those will increase your resilience, durability, and sustainability. The Philosophy Society, like having your weekly meetings like this and having a group to talk with and understand things and express yourself, that's a process goal. Because at least you have like a place to like dump all the shit out, clean yourself up, and then go through another week, and then you come back and then clean it out and then go back forth, right? At least mentally. Like assuming there's a degree of cognitive capacity, which everyone in the room has. So, yeah. So that's one thing in itself. But how we evaluate content goal or the process goals is a different thing, right? And that's where ethics comes in. That's one. And then comparing the goals to the universal constants. So there's the human condition, but there might also be like a social orientation. I'm saying orientation because I'm trying to get away from like hierarchy or like just even the word society. There's a way that humans may orient themselves, the positioning of different kinds of personalities, cognitive capacities, you know, in a balanced way. That's like utopia. It's like, okay, what is that? I don't know. Is it a puzzle that we can put together? Are all the pieces there? Let's just be hopeful. Okay, let's be hopeful. A piece is missing. Maybe we can figure out a way to bridge the gap, right? So social orientation, one thing would be like the social contract. Another thing would be like politics, right? Those two things are part of our social orientation. Like Aristotle says that humans are a political animal, necessarily. You know, like we've evolved and been in cities for so long, we've had to figure out a way to make it work. And politics is a very abstract, intentional way to arrange that like group of stuff, people, right? It's just a big bunch of like hay in a pile. It's chaotic. It's like you don't take the hay and like organize it like this. It'll take forever. You just take a big basket of hay and just throw it. Humans are not like that. I don't really think very many animals are like that. None of them are really. There's instincts for organization. And in some ways that's embedded in our human condition. So these are just remember I said there's axioms to the system? That's just what we're working with. And a big part of it is based in evolution. So another part, so now you can say, well, for example, like, okay, well, maybe the reason that there are rapists is because evolutionarily, that's how humans survived. And so are we supposed to say that that's acceptable too? Well, no, right? Being a naturalist, I didn't look that up, by the way. So let's go back into that.
No worries.
Being a naturalist could say that, violence is acceptable. It's part of our evolutionary history, therefore it's okay, right? Or people that say that like whatever's natural is good for you. I like to only have like natural water, no fluoride, or grass-fed meat or whatever. Anything that's natural is good for you. Well, that doesn't make sense, right? Because cyanide's a natural substance, and the toxicity of cyanide will like kill a human being, right? So we can't really appeal to evolution. We can look at evolution for how things are structured in a certain way, right? For our social orientation. Because you could say that tyrants are natural too. The one that has the most power comes in and just fucking boom, punches a dude in the head. That's it. That's justice, right? Book one, Plato. Plato says no, it's not. Might doesn't make right. Okay. And so what we want to do is we want to take, where's my thing here?
So both those tyrants and rapists, pedophiles, murderers, and whatnot, the ones that are in, let's say, the system in the prison.
Sure.
From my knowledge, I'm not sure that they go through a lot of psychological analysis, correct? They just throw them in there and they just do their own thing, right? To the most extent. So I was thinking, what if they start doing brain scans on the type of criminals that they are, like all the pedophiles, do certain brain scans and see the similarities in the structure of the brain, so they can see maybe that's do something with the structure.
Yeah. Like, there's some psychologists that may be arguing for that for sure. Part of it is like a human rights thing. You can't just start going and take people's blood or start just doing brain scans and throwing people in prison. Like there's like institutional barriers to that. Because then you might just like lie and say that this person has a brain problem and just throw them in jail. Like they're like, oh, Prime Minister Trudeau, he's a pedophile. We scanned his brain, he's going to jail, but it's not real. So
Not like for the ones that are in jail.
yeah, like that's a different thing. Like, what do these people's rights have? If they're already there, then they're already in prison, right? And the criminal justice system, in that sense, is in some ways evidence that even though humans may have the capacity to behave in a certain way, and that helped us with evolutionary times in the past, we're beyond that now. We don't need to act this way anymore, right? That's what being civilized means. That's what we mean when we say we're not animals in that way. We are, but we're like superordinate animals. We're like aliens almost. People think we are aliens, And just because we have things like politics, because we have things like ethics, because of our capacity for empathy, right? We can feel the pain of others. We can understand intellectually what other people's pain is.
Not everyone, though.
Not everybody.
People are empathetic. Other people, I don't know why or how they can't feel.
But just to respond to what you were saying earlier about scanning the brains of people that are already incarcerated, there was a doctor named Robert Keel. He worked with Dr. Robert Hare from BC. Robert Hare was actually the doctor who invented the Hare psychopathy checklist, which is used to more or less diagnose psychopathy. And essentially what he did for his PhD was that he was allowed to go into prisons and do CT scans of inmates, and the overwhelming majority of them all uniformly had the same brain structure, where there was a big part of the brain that just doesn't function. Which is an interesting argument for, again, the whole psychopathy. Probably there are variations to their crimes, but more or less they had that kind of, a cognitive deficiency. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was Hare so he did his own brain scan, and then he couldn't find the brain scan. And then his graduate student came to him and was like, this brain scan's mixed in with the psychopath brain scans. He's like, that's my brain scan. He's like, that's not supposed to be in there. So he took it out, and then he checked his brain scan again, and it turned out that he was a psychopath. There's a, I think is it not Legion of Psychopaths? I have the book at home. It's a green book, but he's a psychopath, and he found out because they mixed his brain scan in with the subjects of the brain scan, and he asked his friends, he's like, "Do you think I'm a psychopath?" They're like, "Well, you're a little weird sometimes." He's like, "What the hell?" So, you know about that?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Super, I guess, interesting, eerie story kind of thing. It's like,
I think it also maybe he found out that the reason that he didn't quite turn out to be his environment was important. So it's like an interaction of it needs to be both the environment and the brain structure.
yeah, for sure. And that's why having a healthy social group. So when we go back to this appeal of evolution, we can say that there's a lot of natural phenomena that humans have needed to get us to a certain point, but that's not a justification for how we should act now, right? And so we have an application. So we use something called what Nietzsche talks about, a revaluation of values, right? But not only a revaluation of values, but in some ways evaluating our behavior as well. Because when we look at the functional analysis, right, there's the end goal value. We can look at this. What is the hierarchy of values? Number one, down to the nth value, right? And then we can ask, is it something to be valued at all? And when we get the person who's going to commit some heinous act, we will say, why are you doing this? And so the technique there is to be Socratic and to apply it. And then you might get some weird justifications for that, right? That might be idiosyncratic. Well, I'm just a dominant person. I need to exercise my dominance. Some narcissistic bullshit answer, right? And then we can evaluate that answer on that statement on its own and then start to deconstruct it, right? And we go back to these universal constants, social orientation. Well, what kind of a world are we going to live in? If all the dots, we've been there before. And we currently have that problem with tyranny. We haven't really gotten over it yet. And so that's one of the responses of the Philosophy Society is understanding this content, learning how to apply the information, right? And if everybody can do that, and we universalize this understanding and application, then when we're in a democracy, right, or even if we're not in a democracy, we can at least rally together to overthrow the tyrannical government, right? And there's reasons for that. Anyways, some properties are like liberty or freedom, like our human rights. We go back to those, right? So we'll put that here. We can talk about animal rights, but that's a different discussion. So, okay. This makes sense, right? I think so, some degree. And so one thing is process goals. This is the takeaway. Process goals are different than content goals, right? And certain things that you do will make you more resilient, durable, and sustainable in your well-being trajectory, right? And some of those things are like the slow, deep breathing stuff, that your social group, who you associate with, the kinds of people, having boundary, and for the social thing, having certain kinds of boundaries, right? If someone does something, that affects me, how do I manage that, right? And that's super important. Basic needs, how you obtain income in the world, right? Are you giving up your identity to do this job? If so, that's going to really affect this well-being graph for that person, right? Substance use, like I have a client that has some substance use issues, and so that's something that we're gonna have to talk about, and that's a challenge depending on the substance, right? And yeah, that's what I wanted to go through today, because last time we talked about certain properties of the function, right? Different things that the being can be aware of that are relative to this trajectory. Like, what can you do to change your well-being function, where you're currently at, how you feel, right? And then what matters to you, is there certain kinds of people that you want in your life based on different kinds of relationships and needs, right? Are there certain goals? Like you just went to Europe. That was a goal. Made it happen. Right? Did it. Successful. Boom. Done. Now there might be a new goal, a post-Europe goal.
Yeah. There's a few actually.
Right? Which is fine.
Without,
And so-
without goals, I believe we don't really have direction. We're kind of just bouncing off and floating around.
Mhm.
Someone wise said, I forgot who said it, but I have a little sticky note in my room right beside my computer. It's like, without a plan, you'll become someone else's plan. I was floating, someone's like, hey, you want to do this? Yeah, sure. And you go there, and you go there. You don't really have your own set of direction, I guess, or path.
Yeah. So there can be intrinsic goals, right? So you just do it for the sake of doing it. And well-being in some ways is intrinsic. But if I don't have it, if there's a negation or the absence of, the attainment of well-being may become a means to it's an end that I want to achieve. But well-being is not just like a threshold constant. It's always kind of progressively going up. And like this graph eventually will become like just a small section of a larger graph. You know, and our lives, as we habituate our current state, the mind will seek to find new stimulation, new things to challenge you with. And that's where we get into like the state of flow. So that would go, that's kind of like a process thing. Right? And flow is when you have an optimum amount of challenge and success or achievement within that activity. And so you want to orient that. You need to get yourself into a position. It's best to get yourself into a position of balance first of your well-being, and then you can have certain goals and have a state of flow with that, right? And that's where we want to be individually. And then we can talk about like a social context. This is really about the person and how we're going to use. It's so funny at the beginning of the day. The board's always empty, but by the end of the day, it's full. You know, when we're done the discussion. Yeah.
Please correct me if I'm wrong with regards to the flow state.
Yeah.
I recall reading an article that mentioned that our optimal state of concentration, or we are at our best when we are in a situation where we are faced with something that is just slightly above our capability.
Yeah.
And we kind of get into this, like something turns on where we really kind of maximize our kind of potential at that moment when we're faced with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's the challenge part.
Okay.
Because if it's too easy, then you get bored. And if it's too challenging, you get frustrated. So it has to do with like the learning curve, right? And like really good video games, the designers of the game learn how to orient that. Learn how to orient the difficulty of the game relative to, in some ways, like there's a standard deviation, you know, and they want to kind of get around the center of the graph of what people find appealing from a degree of challenge. And we really want to do that for ourselves though. Like how much stress can you handle, you know? And what, if stress was like a coin, like a token, like your cortisol, like where will I spend my stress today? You know? And if you go into stress debt, that's like bad. There's like physiological, like I go into stress debt too much. Like the criticism from the crowd would be, Achilles, you're taking on too much. Like Natalia does this all the time. And that's, I agree, you're right. But we really want to figure out the best ratio for ourselves. Because some things may be more challenging for one person than they are for another person, right? As time went on and you did things, you may become more skilled in certain areas, or the environmental conditions just tempered you. You're like, oh, I'm used to this. This is nothing. I can deal with this shit. Who cares? No big deal. Whereas somebody else might get very irritated and frustrated. They're like, whoa, this is a lot for me to handle right now. And so they may, and also your personality too. If you're more of an introvert versus extrovert, you maybe get very stressed. Like some people standing in front of people like this and talking, they could not do it. It's like, oh, it gives them anxiety, right? Whereas I'm like, whatever, I can talk about stuff all day. Like this is like very little preparation for me, right? I'm just talking about it, right? And that's just what I do. But if someone said, I need you to talk to a group of people well-being for an hour, You know, where like some people would be like, whoa, I can't do that. But if you prepare in advance, then the challenge becomes manageable, right? And so I'm kind of preparing for this like every day. Like every person I talk to, I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, whoa.
I think stress is a type of trauma.
Stress can lead to trauma, but stress is good for you, right? Stress will motivate you and can make you more resilient. A big part of it is how you perceive the stress. If you have an optimistic, engaging attitude towards stress, like I can do it, I can overcome this, it can be very good for your growth. But if you feel overwhelmed by the stress and you have distorted thinking and you're like, this is going to kill me, it's going to destroy me, right? That's not good for you. That's actually bad for you. Like you guys know about a recent, very stressful thing that I had to deal with for 7 months. You, Natalia, know about that. On my wall, I wrote, "This will not destroy me." You know, and I looked at it. It was right before my light switch. Every day, I will not let this destroy me. Right? It could have, but it didn't fucking happen. All right. And so I'll see you guys next week.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
It was a pleasure. And on that note, I just want to say, in terms of you said stress, if you do it properly, it can be a valuable experience.
Yes.
I can't recall if it's Tolstoy or Dostoevsky who said, suffering can be a religious experience if done properly.
Very good.
Oh, I just want to speak about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice meeting you.
Nice
Yeah.
meeting you guys.
Have a good night.
Okay, so that was basically it for today. What was the next step? I think next week, if this was individually based, next week is more about like social orientation. I think that's the next step to go. So you go from what the person does functionally, and then what the group does functionally, because we have just one person here. So I think that's next week. And really that just goes back to the philosophy society. That's what that's supposed to. All conclusions, all roads lead to the same, lead to Rome. Philosophy society is Rome. Except for the bad stuff, like the crucifixions and the empire. It's a joke. Bad. Anything you want to say? No, it's very interesting. Definitely. You guys?
I'm a little bit late.
It's okay.
I write everything down in order. I know where it started, where it ended.
Yeah.
I understand most of it. I just didn't have time to see that part. Bennett Fish.
So those are the ethical principles, right? That's how we evaluate our actions. So we would say that the some things that may have aided us evolutionarily, we are now say are unethical, right? And beneficence is the duty to do good. Non-maleficence is the duty to not cause harm, which would be like the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. Autonomy is like your agency and your capacity to make informed decisions. Justice is about fairness, balance. Utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham. The categorical imperative is not to use people as a means to an end, to respect them as an end in themselves. That's based on their intentions and what they want of things. And universalizability is to take a principle as a maxim, as a action-directed statement, and it ought to be applied to everyone, not just one individual. Because that way a person couldn't exploit some principle and use it for their own ends.
What was the second one called?
Maleficence.
Non-maleficence.
They're on the website under ethical intimacy. If you just type in ethical intimacy, Achilles Justice, you'll get the page.
And utilitarianism.
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 Yes. Okay, so that's good for this week.